Hello, everyone. Hello to our audience on Zoom and those here in the library. It's a beautiful space. I'm very excited. This is my first time here for a program. So we like to welcome everyone to our programs, and you can see our diversity, equity, and inclusion statement on our website, the full thing. But we just want the whole community to know that the birds that we all enjoy come in a diversity of colors and shapes, and so do people, and we value all of the differences, and they make us a more rich and wonderful community. So thank you for being here. At the beginning, so I'm Juliette Berger. I'm the president of Washtenaw Audubon. We usually talk a little bit about upcoming programs. We talk about interesting bird sightings at the beginning of our program, so we'll do the interesting bird sightings, and we'll thank the library for hosting us. Does anyone, I see Kathy, does anyone have a interesting bird sighting that they would like to share? Kathy does.
Just a couple of hours ago at my urban pond, it's not a pond, it's a pondless waterfall, female Cape May warbler came. Whoa. And I have a teeny tiny little backyard, but that water feature really attracts them. I got good pictures too.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Kathy.
I should mention that we were, for Tuesday Evening Birders, we were out at Green Lake Road, going to the Green Lake campground. We do it along Embry Road, and we saw a lot of great birds, but I wanted to just point out that we heard the whippoorwill singing, and then we had a little family of barred owls that were squeaking and begging, and presumably one of the parents was feeding them, and it was really fun we could kind of see them a little bit. It was fun to watch.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you for all your help in organizing Tuesday Evening Birders. We have 2 more Tuesday Evening Birders. We go out every Tuesday in May. This year we have 4, so that was our second at Embry Road, and we'll be going to another mystery location, which I will not divulge because I do not even know where it is, and only Matthew does, but don't bother him. He will not tell you. If you register for Tuesday Evening Birders, you will get the information about where to meet sometime Tuesday morning, if not before. It's a lot of fun. It's great for working people, and we go and see a lot of amazing birds. Our first Tuesday Evening Birders, we saw and heard an American bittern. So you get what you pay for, even though you didn't pay anything, but you're going to get a lot of good birds. Thursday morning walks at the Arbor are still continuing. We'll go through the end of May there as well, Thursday at 8 a.m. at the east side of Dow Field in Nichols Arboretum, and I'm almost always there as the official leader of the leaderless walk. And so many of you that I see here are also there, so that's wonderful. And are there any other announcements? Oh, on Saturday we're going to McGee Marsh. So we'll have a meetup at the Plymouth Road Park and Ride. Are we doing that? Yes, Matthew says yes. It's at 5 a.m. for an prompt departure, and we're meeting at 7 a.m. if you go straight there at the Warbler sign on the boardwalk, at McGee Marsh. So I hope to see many people there. That'll be great. Matthew's got a ton of things lined up throughout the summer. More will be added to the website. And Michael, do you want me to announce who we are planning to have as our speaker in June? Yeah, our June speaker will be Don Chalfant talking about birds that say their name and other vocalizations by birds. And Michael, did you want to introduce Jacco? Or you have that with you. And so check out the website and Facebook. There's lots of great stuff. And here comes Mike Sefton, our program chair and vice president, to talk about Jacco.
It is my distinct honor to introduce Jacco Gelderloos. Jacco is a longtime Washtenaw Audubon member and board member, one of the best birders in the county, certainly. He's won the Wingnut Award 1 year, that is, for finding the greatest number of species in the county in 1 year. He won the Big Green Big Year Award for the most species seen while walking, bicycling, or pogo sticking. And finally, he edits our newsletter, our bi-monthly newsletter. Please welcome Jacco Gelderloos.
Thank you, Mike and Juliet. It's great to be here. So today I am going to take you on a bit of a trip to far eastern Cuba, particularly the province of Guantanamo. First and foremost, a good number of the pictures in this presentation are mine. Quite a few of them are not, and for those, I have actually put the name of the photographer in brackets behind the pictures because credit where credit is due. First and foremost, Guantanamo to a lot of people in the U.S. means a U.S. base around a bay with a very icky prison around it. Unfortunately, there's a whole lot more to Guantanamo than a U.S. Army base that's a relic of the 1898 Spanish-American War, and hopefully I can make that clear with this presentation. So, first and foremost, where is Cuba? Most of you will know that it's right south of Florida, and its capital, Havana, is just over 1,300 miles due south from Ann Arbor. It's the biggest Caribbean island by far, about 42,800 square miles, and there's about 11 million people on the island, which I think is a outdated statistic because people are leaving in droves. So I'd say probably closer to 10 million at this point. From the western tip to the eastern tip, the island is about 700 miles, so that's a pretty good size, and split up in 16 states, or 16 provinces, which is roughly our states. As far as birds are concerned, which is the important thing, obviously, there's about 380 species on the island. 28 are endemic, 60 of them are endemic subspecies, and there are a bunch of near endemics or birds that you can only find in the West Indies somewhere. So we're going east. So on the far, far eastern tip of Cuba, you can see the province of Guantanamo, and the bay is right there at the bottom left. It's Cuba's easternmost province, obviously. It's about just shy of 2,400 square miles, so about 3 times the size of Washtenaw County, and has 500,000 people living there. Again, probably less now. It's subdivided into 10 municipalities, which is roughly equal to counties in Michigan. Geologically, it's split up by the Nipe-Sagua-Baracoa mountain range, which runs pretty much entirely along the northern coast and ends on the east of the island, which has an interesting climatic effect because to the north and east of the mountains, the climate is very wet, very humid, very tropical, and there are a ton of rivers, so the vegetation is very lush. But on the other hand, in the rain shadow of these mountains on the south side of the island, we're basically dealing with semi-desert. So there's cacti and some shrubs, and that is pretty much it as far as the vegetation is concerned. To illustrate, in the north, we get cacao plantations. In the east, or in the south, we get Turk's cap cactuses growing on bare coral rock, which is very pretty in its own right. So, climate and geology being diverse, you get biodiversity. And on this map, you can see that the areas shaded in gray are the areas of highest biodiversity on the island. As you can see, large chunks of that are in Guantanamo province. On the north part, so the forest and the mountains, Large chunk of that is protected in the Parque Nacional Alejandro Humboldt, which runs from sea level up to the very tippy top of the mountain range at about 3,800 feet. This was also the place where the ivory-billed woodpecker hung on longest, and it's actually featured on in a search on the National Audubon website, which is actually really worthwhile reading. It's a very interesting story. Same thing with the Cuban kite. It used to be present along the rivers coming out of the forest and the mountains here. Probably isn't around anymore because its habitat has degraded and its food source is pretty well endangered as well. The semi-desert areas in the southern coast are also protected, but on a much less grander scale, so that leaves something to be desired. Couple of quick things about Guantanamo itself. It's actually the first place the Spaniards visited. In 1492, Columbus landed on what is now Baracoa and planted a cross in the name of the Spanish king to claim the island. That cross is actually still sitting in the cathedral in Baracoa, which is actually kind of cool. The governor of Cuba, a few years later, founded the city of Baracoa in 1511, which makes it the first actual city on the island, made it the first capital city of the island, and the Baracoans are very proud of that and refer to their city as the Ciudad Primera, or the primary city. Along the southern coast is the landing site of Maceo Grajales and Juan Martí, who are some of the founding fathers of independent Cuba in the war against the Spaniards. This is where they came in from their overseas, I can't think of the word, from their overseas stay, if you will. So exile, that's the word. So they landed there in 1895. Obviously, it took a while for Cuba to get independent in 1898. That said, with all those historical features, Baracoa in particular is a very remote region of Cuba. So up until the 1960s, the only way to get there was by boat. You could not drive there, you could not fly there, you had to have a boat. That changed in the mid-60s when the government completed a road from the southern coast through the mountains up to Baracoa, and it's called La Farola. We've driven La Farola. It's an adventure. However, that isn't an updated version of La Farola because the original La Farola was completely destroyed in 2016 by Hurricane Matthew and had to be completely rebuilt. So some of the scenes you can see, this is the road along the southern coast. Matthew came in from the south. Obviously, huge chunks of coral all over the road. Roads got washed out. So Baracoa was effectively back to an island on the island. I would not even go so far as to call it the road along the northern coast was also completely destroyed because several of the bridges washed out. So even the secondary access point was out of the picture. So Baracoa was back to being fully isolated. Now, that's neither here nor there at this point. Our trip. There we go. Whoop. So, in June of 2022, my wife and I and one of my wife's cousins and her husband traveled to Cuba to visit family. Now, at the time, you could only fly into Havana, and we had looked into ways to get from Havana to Baracoa. We had seen that you could take a bus. The bus ride was 21 hours, and we were very hesitant to take on a bus, which we had no idea what that was going to be like. So, optimists that we were, we rented a car. According to the map that you see in front of you, that trip is supposed to take about 16 hours, which even for 625 miles is a pretty good amount of time. That still is very optimistic because of lack of gasoline or unreliable gasoline supplies, crazy traffic, and any number of other factors. Our trip that should have taken 16 hours took 26. So if you're in Cuba, take the bus. It's hung up. There we go. Oh, Jesus. So, first and foremost, we got to Havana. We stayed in a neighborhood called Vedado, and as a birder, what do? You look for birds. So the local equivalent of the robin, the red-legged thrush, is very common, much like the robin is. I think it's a super handsome bird. This slaty gray color with like the black details, a little white here and there, and then the red eye-ring and the red legs. Absolutely gorgeous. This happens to be the Western Cuban subspecies. There's also an Eastern Cuban subspecies, but obviously you're not going to see that in Havana. There we go. Hang on while things get sorted out in the presentation. I'm not quite sure what's happening here. All right, here we go. So, there are two species of hummingbird native to Cuba. This is one of them. This is the Cuban emerald, or the zunzun, which is a wonderfully onomatopoeic name. It's beautiful, it's big, and it's very common. So all the flowering bushes in Vedados, which is in the middle of Havana, had Cuban emeralds. So we saw several of these. Obviously, a great start to a visit, seeing an endemic / near endemic bird like that one. Also over Cuba, or over Havana, were flocks of Cuban martins, which are endemic in the sense that they only nest on Cuba. They winter somewhere in the Amazon. Nobody exactly knows where they are. I think they just recently figured that out by geo-tracking them. But as you can see, the difference between our purple martin and Cuban martins is the little bit of white on the lower abdomen. And to set them apart from Caribbean martins, which occur in other islands of the Caribbean, they would have even more white on the belly. So it's a tricky identification, but in June in Cuba, good chance that whatever martin you're seeing is in fact a Cuban martin. So then, the next day, we get on the road. Give it some time. So our road trip was supposed to take 2 days. We were going from Havana to a town called Camagüey, and then from Camagüey to Baracoa. Didn't quite work out, as you will see, but here we are. All right. Let me just use this. Thing is hung up again. Yeah, it's stuck. All right, so bear with us. So while that's being fixed, I can tell you that Havana is a crazy city. It's huge, but there's still a lot of wildlife around. We saw tons of, like I said, Cuban emeralds. We saw bunches of Cuban martins, red-legged thrush. I even saw a pair of Cuban parrots overhead, which, here we go. Oh, let's not. There we go. So we get on the road. Yeah, I think it's working now. So on the road, you see birds along the roadside. Most of them, what you would expect to see here, so things like cattle egrets were exceedingly common, snowy egrets in wetlands, all of that. There were also more unusual birds, specifically great lizard cuckoos, which we saw on the regular, and they're absolutely amazing birds. If you ever find your way yourself in the Caribbean, make it a point to go look for lizard cuckoos. They're cool. Slightly less fancy are the tawny-shouldered blackbirds, which is the equivalent of red-winged blackbirds. They were quite common as well, and like I said, not quite as fancy. We skirted the rather famous Zapata Swamp, which unfortunately we did not get a chance to visit, at least unfortunately for me. But we did get to see some of the birds that are typically associated with the habitats there, one of them being a Cuban blackhawk, which is a pretty snazzy and handsome endemic raptor to the islands. We also saw the endemic subspecies for red-tailed hawk, meadowlarks, all of that stuff. Oh, like I said, they're all endemic subspecies. Some of them might actually be split at some point. Who knows? I'm not the expert on that. But our road trip, like I said, we were aiming to get to Camagüey. We got nowhere near there because it got dark. We were told, absolutely do not drive in the dark. I tried for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and told my companions, I'm going to kill somebody doing this. Let's find a place to stay. So we did. We stayed in a little town called Ciego de Avila, about an hour and a half short of where we were supposed to be. Oh well. Good thing for me, as a birder, the next morning while I was loading up the car, a pair of Cuban parakeets flew over, which is an endangered endemic and was the only two that I saw on the trip. So sometimes a bad thing is a good thing. Cuba is also a place where you see a lot of introduced things. Now, most famously, the old American cars from the 50s. There's also a ton of Russian cars from the 70s and 80s, and any number of other vehicles that you would think should not be driving around. We saw Dutch buses, which, as a Dutchman myself, was absolutely surreal to see buses driving around with Dutch place names on them still. Bird-wise, introduced species, we saw a helmeted guinea fowl in the middle of nowhere, not associated with any kind of farm, so this, I would venture to guess, was a feral bird, and a pretty interesting surprise to me. So then we're getting close to Baracoa. I'm by and large delirious at this point. We're driving down the northern coastal road, which is, as the people in the National Audubon Society article about the ivory-billed woodpecker describe it, is a non-road. This is unpaved, terrible. It's the worst road I've ever been on. The bridges are scary as, I can't even say this in polite company, but it was not a fun road and it was starting to get dark. So we stopped at this place called Playa Maguana. And we pulled in and I heard this. Hang on. Now, imagine that you're standing there half out of your mind, having driven 13 hours in crazy traffic, crazy roads. What in God's name is that? So, any guesses? It's a crow. So there was a group of Cuban crows hanging out in the top of a palm tree making that noise. Absolutely bizarre noise for a crow. I really got to liking it once I figured out what it was, and just something very different than your typical caw, 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 which they also do, by the way. So also at Playa Maguana was this handsome fella. This is a West Indian woodpecker. Obviously, you can see it's a close relative of our red-bellied woodpeckers, and they really seem to like the coastal areas, so we're on palm trees, and just overall very enjoyable to see it. So we drive down the road, a little farther still. My wife actually, in the dark, guided me across some of the bridges, walking in front of the car with her cell phone, lighting the way so that we could pick the most advantageous route across the bridges. But eventually, we made it. So here we are, Baracoa. Now, obviously, this is a site for sore eyes. As you can see on the left, the harbor of the town is a beautifully scenic place. Lovely view of the famous El Yunque mountain, which is a flat-top mountain that, what's his name, Columbus mentioned in his writing, so it's quite famous. And on the right, you can see the view from Villa Paradiso, which was the bed and breakfast that we stayed at, that I found through eBird. As you can see, the view has greenery in view, and so what do you do when you have greenery in view? You go looking for birds. Again, lots of Cuban emeralds here. There were flowers everywhere in June, and the emeralds were going crazy, so they were chasing each other around. I would say there were 5 or 6 of them hanging around the property, and it was just really cool to see. The other cool thing was in the tree line just beyond Via Paradiso was a pair of Cuban Orioles that were hanging out and just doing Oriole things and just putting on a really, really lovely show. For those of you who have ever been to Florida, in southern Florida, you see next slide gets hung up again. Okay then. Bear with us. What's that? Ah, good. Oh yeah, absolutely. We're having some technical difficulties. There we go. All right. So if you've ever been to southern Florida, you've seen these. This is a gray kingbird. There was a pair nesting within sight of the balcony. So as you can see on the bottom right, there's a couple of little youngsters right there on the just next to the pole. Mom and Dad were bringing in food like on the right, like ridiculously quickly. I'd never thought that they would be bringing food in that quickly, but they did, and the youngsters were growing like crazy. There's other animals around too. So on the left, you can see the Cuban endemic tree frogs that were coming out. As soon as darkness hit, they were hanging out in the gardens, and then as soon as the darkness fell, they came and checked out the lights because that's where the bugs were that they were trying to catch. By the same token, there were some tropical house geckos there, which is not native to Cuba, but they were pretty common around the grounds of the Via Paradiso. So my wife and I have an agreement that if we go to places that are exotic or otherwise new to us, I get to go birding for a day or part of a day. Same here. I got to go on an excursion to the Humboldt National Park. Our host, Roberto, is a birder. Like I said, I found his place through eBird. So he suggested that the two of us and our driver head up to the national park and be guided around by his friend Indio, which is what we did. So really, really early one morning, we drove up the non-road along the north coast and were treated to some amazing sunrise scenery on our way to the Parque Nacional Alejandro Humboldt. This is the landscape that we encountered at our first stop. So at lower elevation, it was kind of brushy with some low trees. And then as the higher we went up the mountain, Cuban pines started dominating, and so it became really a pine forest. And from this particular spot, we were scanning the ridge line in hopes of encountering a sought-after bird here that nests nearby. India wasn't quite sure where the nest was, but he knew that they would love this place here, and he was right. So we came across Gundlach's hawks, which is the Cuban equivalent of Cooper's hawks. Very, very handsome bird, very feisty bird, and all the other birds went immediately quiet as soon as this bird started circling the forest. Luckily, he left, and we got to continue birding in search of the next target bird, which appeared very soon thereafter. And there it is. If there was any bird that you would have asked me, what do you want to see on Cuba, this would have been it. I cannot begin to tell you how cool it was to see these. They are literally about that big, and like hummingbirds, much more feisty than their size would lead you to believe. And it was just amazing. We had such great views of them. We saw probably 6 or 8 of them, and they were, I mean, they're very hard to find. And Indio knew exactly where they were going to be. He said, this is the place to look for them. If we don't see them here, then not sure what we're going to do, but lots and lots of bee hummingbirds, which was very, very cool. The Cuban name for this bird, you remember the Cuban emerald is called a zunzun. This is a zunzuncito. So a little hummer, if you will. Very appropriate. So then, as we were walking around, we came across some other Antillean nighthawk who was pretty much acting like a killdeer, and we were wondering what that was about. And then on the bottom right, you can see what that was about. There was a chick on the edge of the trail, so had we not had the mother flush and try to distract us, we would not have seen this fella, and we might have stepped on it actually, so good thing she did. Very cute little fella. Not very handsome, but, you know, what are you going to do? Very cool to see an Antillean nighthawk not over a city flying around, but just on the ground, taking care of its baby, which is neat. And at this point, we actually looked back down toward the coast, and we saw Cuban parrots sitting in the treetops. I'd seen a couple over Vedado, nothing like as well as we saw these. There were probably 6, 7 of them sitting in a palm tree, just doing what parrots do, chattering away, feeding, just being silly and flying in and out. So very good, very nice to get such good looks at them. And from this point onwards, endemic birds just were everywhere. Now, mind you, this is June, so it's the nesting season. There are no northern migrants around, so pretty much all the birds we were seeing were either endemic nesting birds or just locals. So among those, this little fella. If you've ever been to the Caribbean, especially to the Greater Antilles, this should be one of the birds that you're going to try and find. Toadies are absolutely ridiculously cute. The family, there's 5 species in the family. They're unique to the Caribbean. They only occur on the Greater Antilles, so there's 1 in Puerto Rico, 1 in Cuba, 1 in Jamaica, and 2 in Hispaniola. And I would say they are absolutely worth seeking out. They are adorable. They have personality. They're just great little birds, not to mention nice to look at. Surprisingly common is the Cuban trogon, or the tocororo. It's Cuba's national bird. I had expected this to be a very hard bird, very hard to find, much like resplendent quetzals in Guatemala can be impossible to find. These were impossible not to find. Once you're cued into the call, literally everywhere. This was the background noise of this hike. It's like a constant, which is where it gets its name from. And they were very vocal, very present, and I mean, how can you get enough of a bird looking like that? Also in the pine forests, a Cuban pygmy owl showed up. Owls generally are associated with the dark. This, not so much the pygmy owls. They're active during the day, and they came and checked. This one came and checked us out. It was really kind of neat to see, and right on cue too, because Indio had predicted that it would show up right about here, and lo and behold, there it was. Come on. All right, here we go. So, I'm not sure if you can hear this well enough, but this is a Cuban solitaire singing. And we had about 3 or 4 of them along the ridgeline in the forest. It was kind of foggy, and so this ethereal song was just ringing all around it. It was really, really neat. The bird itself isn't much to look at. Think of a veery without any spots, but the call and the song is just very, very cool. Like I mentioned, endemics were coming fast and furious, so Cuban green woodpeckers, very common. Cuban peewees, very common, acting very much like peewees do. Western spindalis, this is actually an interesting thing to me. I think this should probably be a Cuban endemic species. All the other spindaluses on the Greater Antilles have been split off into their own species, but this one is apparently not. It's currently lumped with the Bahamian version of the same species, but I think this is probably a future split. But more endemics. Cuban bullfinch is actually, I grew up with bullfinches in Europe, which are showy, very colorful birds. This one, not so much. Actually kind of shy, but handsome in its little black outfit. Not so shy and much more common. Cuban blackbirds, they were everywhere. This is your default blackbird in Cuba. Not a whole lot more to say about them than that they're blackbirds and they're everywhere. Final two endemics of this particular part of the trip. Cuban vireos, they have this really wonky little song that once you're cued into it, easy to pick out. It's looking similar but very unique is the Oriente warbler. So this is the eastern species. There's another species on the west side of the island, and this is a member of the family of the Cuban warblers. They became their own family not very long ago, and so now if you want to see all the bird families of the world, you have to go to Cuba because this family occurs only there. Pretty neat little birds, acting very much like wood warblers, but apparently not wood warblers anymore. So after this very successful little hike, we moved on to a different trail. It's called El Recreo. As you can see, the landscape is very different. It's much more densely vegetated. As you can see, I'm walking through a forest that's closing in on me for all intents and purposes. And it got worse. So the trail was literally about this wide. Let's see, come on. There we go. So as you can see, that's Indio walking in front of me. Roberto took this pictures because he brought up the rear, but this was a pretty dodgy trail. And had I not known that there were no venomous animals in Cuba, I would have been nervous that I might step on a snake or anything of that sort. So luckily there are none. That was not something to worry about. The vegetation, on the other hand, was. As you can see, I'm not sure if it comes through on the picture here, but this palm frond has spikes on it that are scary, at least. These were 3-4 inches long and sharp as can be. Furthermore, there was a plant that I would call poison ivy on steroids. We had been warned not to touch it because if you do, you not only get a rash, you actually can get infections. People that have been infected by the stuff have lifelong scars on their arms or legs wherever they brushed up against it. So this was not one I wanted to encounter, which luckily I did not. So why did we go here? Well, we were hoping for an encounter with this bird. The gray-fronted quail dove is, as quail doves do, very shy, very retiring, and we found one, but we never actually saw it. It was calling up a storm. We tried to find exactly where it was, could not get it, and this was in steep terrain, so unfortunately we had to do with a recording and move on. Much less shy, loads and loads of these coming up. Lasagras flycatcher. Some of you will have seen these in Florida where they occasionally show up as vagrants, but these were also everywhere. So this is the Cuban or West Indian version of the great crested flycatcher, as you can probably tell. There's not just birds on Cuba, believe it or not. And there's some other interesting wildlife that we came across on this particular hike. And you will see I've used my hand as the come on. What? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I can't. There we go. So, we came across this, I would say, humongous yellow-banded millipede, which, as you can see, is the size of my index finger, if not bigger. On the other side of the non-bird critter spectrum, on my thumbnail there, you can see a Monte Iberia eluth frog, which that is an adult. That is not a little frog. That is actually as big as they get. And it's one of the world's smallest frogs. They're adorable little. They make the cutest little pink noise. And this one actually, Indio got it to hop on his hand, and then gave it to me, and I had it sitting on my thumb for this particular picture, which was really pretty cool to have a dapper little frog like that sitting on my finger. Quite endangered too, by the way. These mountains, and actually most of eastern Cuba, have a ton of endemic orchids. If you are at all interested in plants, this is probably, I would say this is a must-visit location. It's absolutely stunning. We came across quite a few of them in the forest itself, but also on the property of some of the farmers nearby. So what they do is they actually grow them on their farm in the trees around their house, and that brings in ecotourism. So visitors to the national park actually stop by their property to come see the orchids like we did. And it's a really cool way to help the local community protect the environment, protect their heritage, really. And they're very proud to have this on their property. This particular farmer was absolutely excited to have us out there, and he took us from one to the next and the next, and then we was like, no, there's another one, there's another one. So it was really cool to see his enthusiasm about these absolutely beautiful flowers. And this was only the tip of the iceberg. If you look at the Via Paradiso website, which is at the end of the presentation, Roberto has a ton of pictures of not only these orchids, but probably a half dozen to a dozen more because of different habitat requirements, and they're amazing. So as you can see, we had a really good morning of birding in the Humboldt National Park. That said, I will want to come back because there are some things that I didn't see. For example, the local subspecies of sharp-shinned hawk on the left, which is sufficiently different from the sharp-shinned hawks that we're all used to, that the Caribbean subspecies will likely be split off into a separate hawk. Same with the South American versions. So stay tuned. You might get an arm tick out of that. On the right, who doesn't love an owl? Well, there's Stygian owls in the mountains. We missed the nesting pair that Indio had been monitoring by probably a couple of weeks. They had moved from their nesting area, and he had not been able to find them anymore. So unfortunately, if we'd gone in May, we'd have gotten to see some Stygian owls. A couple of other really neat endemics in the Humboldt National Park. Giant kingbird, which is like your eastern kingbird, but then supersized. Unique to Cuba, again. And this area of the country is probably one of the best places to see them, although you have to be willing to endure a very bumpy car ride and then a rather grueling hike up to the area where they're at. On the bottom right, the other small owl in Cuba, the bare-legged owl. This one is nocturnal, so we did not know where there was a place to go see them, where there was a hole in the tree, so missed that one too, but such is life, gives you a reason to go back. So, after a lovely morning in the national park, that's me and Roberto with Indio. I'm not sure why they're not smiling. They were never smiling in the pictures. Beats me why that is, but I had a good time, so obviously I was smiling. So that basically was our trip in 2022 as far as the birding aspect was. We went back earlier this year with my wife's brother and his wife, and we got lucky. So in the meantime, we could now fly into Santiago de Cuba, which, as you can see on the dot on the map, is a lot closer to Baracoa. The other thing is that we had made connections in Baracoa, so instead of having to rent a car and make a grueling drive, we were now picked up with a taxi and were driven for 4.5, 5 hours to our destination, and that was that. So we got smart, we learned some lessons. You know, don't rent a car in Cuba, don't drive yourself around in Cuba, just ask other people to do it, and that works out great. Again, I've mentioned this before, what do? Well, you go look for birds, because I'm not driving, so what do? I look out the window. And we saw American kestrels. Now, as you can see, both of these are the Cuban subspecies, but it's quite variable. So the one on the right is nearly white below, the one on the left is very, very rufous. And I saw that on a number of occasions where it's almost like white-throated sparrows, where some of them look like this, others look like that. I'm not sure why that is. What I also noticed is that their habitat requirement seems to be very different from the kestrels here. So we think of kestrels as open country birds, like airports, that kind of thing. These were in shrubby habitats along the roadsides. I'm not sure if that's something that is ecological arrangements that they adapted to the environment that was available there or what, but I just thought it was noteworthy that kestrels in Cuba apparently don't use open territory like we would expect them to do here. Other birds along the way, Antillean palm swifts. Where there was palm trees in the lowlands, there were Antillean palm swifts flying around just like your typical chimney swift does, just in little groups, zooming around. And then when we started heading up La Farola again, there was a Zenaida dove sitting along the road, which is really a very handsome, dark-colored version of the mourning doves. We're back to Villa Paradiso because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's an absolutely wonderful place to stay, and staying with a birder is always good. And so we saw red-legged thrush again because they're common. This, however, is the eastern Cuban subspecies. Has slightly less red on its lower abdomen, so that's really the only difference that I could see. There were also some familiar faces from farther north. Cape May warblers, Kathy mentioned one earlier in her notable bird thing. There were so many Cape May warblers there in January or in February. I probably saw more Cape May warblers around the grounds of Villa Paradiso than I would see in an entire migratory season here. And that was the norm. It was absolutely fantastic. It was the default small bird that showed up. So that was cool. We took a trip to the Yumuri Canyon, which is a famous site. This is when we went in June of 2022, as you can see. Gorgeous scenery, pardon the pun. When we went in 2024, the night before, there had been torrential rains. So it looked a little different. It was very overcast, the water was murky, the water was very high. As you can see, there's little rain droplets falling in the water because it is in fact raining. The way you go up the canyon is you talk to the locals and they actually use a rowboat to row you upstream, and then either you can get out of the rowboat and walk around, or in this case, you go upstream a little bit and then the rain gets too bad and then we turn around, which is what we did here. But nearby was a really cool small-scale conservation thing, much like the orchids that I mentioned before. So this gentleman was raising Polemita snails. And as you can see, these are very colorful snails. They're endemic to eastern Cuba, and they have sort of become a symbol of Cuba for the expat community in southern Florida. And what that means is if you go to a Cuban store in southern Florida, there's racks with little snail shells that you can buy for, I'm not sure how much you can buy them for, but what that means is they get taken from the wild in Cuba, obviously kill the snail, and you have a little snail shell that you can sell. As a result, Polemita snails are highly endangered. So this gentleman was raising them on this big mango tree in his garden, and he would make sure that the young snails would stay on the tree, and then every so often he would take a certain percentage of the Polemita snails' adults and take them into the forest. so as to replenish the population there. Very, very cool, and he was educating people about it. You can see the benches around the big mango tree, so he would actually have people come there, and he would tell them about the Polymita snails and why you shouldn't buy the shells, et cetera, et cetera. A very, very cool initiative, and very typical of what we would come across. So the population is absolutely super proud of their region and wants to protect it best as they can. I mean, the resources are extremely limited. I'll mention that a little more about that later. But the locals definitely want to protect their environment as best as they can. So then this time around, my trip wasn't so much going to be a guided trip. So last time, Indio was literally working for me. I paid him to guide me around the Humboldt National Park. This time, I got invited to come along on the local equivalent of the Washtenaw Bird and Nature Alliance, the Club de Observadores de Aves de Paracoa, or COAB. It's a grassroots group. There's probably about 10, 15 members, and they go on field trips as much as they can. Unfortunately for them, that costs money. So we rented a car. Roberto asked me if I would be willing to help pay for the car. So he and I paid for the car. It cost us, I want to say $35 or $40 each to have the car and the driver for the day to take our group of 8 or 9 people around. That doesn't sound like a whole lot, but for a local, $40 is 2.5 months worth of income. Needless to say, I was more than happy to pay it. I would have paid the whole $80. Let's go birding. So 8 or 9 of us piled up in an old Toyota Land Cruiser, made it down La Farola to the southern coast, and we went to the salt pans of Baitiquiri, which we had driven by. And as you can imagine, salt pans have shorebirds. As you can see by this small group of black-necked stilts, there were probably about 10, 15 times as many in the property altogether. But the main attraction here is flamingos. We saw about 40, 50 flamingos. They were just putzing around these salt pans, not at all shy. They were a little weary of us, but not very flighty. So we got amazing looks at lots and lots of flamingos. They were flying around, doing little loops. So obviously, a day when you see flamingos is a good day. We also came across some familiar faces. So there's wintering shorebirds, obviously. So semi-palmated sandpipers were quite common, lots and lots of stilt sandpipers, and a few blue-winged teal, which I think is just kind of cool to see birds that we are used to seeing here, but in a completely different environment. So I enjoyed that. The other thing about the shorebirds was that I was able to pitch in as far as the identification of the birds was concerned and help out the other birders in the group that some were not as familiar with shorebirds. So we got to debate lesser, greater yellowlegs. Why is that a stilt sandpiper and not something else? So that was good. It was very interactive. It was very much a birding group, but not at all like the guided tour I'd had before. So I like this a lot more, to be brutally honest. So in addition to the familiar faces, we saw some sort of familiar faces. So obviously on the top left, that's a gnatcatcher. However, it's the Cuban gnatcatcher. It's the endemic. This is one of the 3 endemics I had hoped to see on this trip. Pretty much as soon as we got out of the car, there were Cuban gnatcatchers all over the shrubs. On the bottom right is a yellow warbler, but it's of the golden warbler complex, which is the Caribbean version of yellow warblers, which tend to hang out in mangroves. As you can see, that's what this one's doing. The one we saw was doing the absolute same thing, hanging out in the mangroves surrounding the salt pans and singing up a storm. So he was on territory, he was nesting. This is clearly not a migrant. So pretty cool to see a yellow warbler that may or may not actually be a yellow warbler. So from the salt pans, we moved on to the southern coast. And there was not a whole lot of seabird watching going on. We got there, it was very quiet. We saw a couple of royal terns, and that was really about it. So I started scanning the coral cliffs because got to do something. So the view on the left is the overlook. On the right, you can see what I found on the coral cliff. This is basically a fossilized fan coral, which I thought was a very, very cool thing to see. Also found a huge fossilized snail, which was literally fist size, but I left that in Cuba because I wasn't sure that if I put that in my luggage that I was going to get through customs without trouble, so I left that be. So we're standing around, not a whole lot going on with the birding. As you can see, we're just chatting away and doing what it is. Then some stuff started happening. So you can see our driver, Ray, here at the bottom, flat on his belly on the cliff, checking out the cliff on this little cove. Now, before we see what he was looking at, I'd like to point out and thank you all, he is actually using a pair of binoculars that our group donated to the co-op. There was one or two other guys in the group using binoculars that we had donated. Very, very rewarding to see, and it's a wonderful thing that, you know, our small contribution was being put to such great use by these people, building their birding skills, which is exactly why we donated them. So thank you all. So what were we looking at? We were looking at a hung-up slide. So in these cliffs, you want to guess? Whoop, here we go. So that is what we were looking at. There were probably 7 or 8 white-tailed tropic birds whirling around, acting like they were going to fly into these coves and then not, and then maybe so and maybe not. And eventually, a few of them actually dove into the cliffs. And we were able to find a few of them that were barely visible, so that is what our driver, Ray, is looking at. This is the rear end of a white-tailed tropic bird on nest, which was very, very cool. I'd seen white-tailed tropic birds before, but that was just a flyby in Hawaii, or in Jamaica, which was very unsatisfying. We had absolutely killer looks of white-tailed tropic birds here, and this is one of the few reliable nesting grounds on the south coast of Cuba. So very cool, and everybody was very tickled to see them as well as we did. So from this coastal site, we moved on to a semi-desert patch right up the road, and we had a couple more target birds here, the 2 missing endemics being them, and it was just generally a very neat place to go to. It's one of the preserves that I mentioned that the semi-desert area is protected by, and this is called Bate Bate, the Bay of Baitikiri. As you can see, the landscape is very barren, it's very desert-like, but there's pretty flowers. There's a little passion flower that's just barely coming up above the grass. I thought it was very neat to see. Not sure that this is an actual passion fruit, but it sure looks like a passion flower to me. Looking back, you can see the Caribbean, so we're right on the coast, but nothing but grass, cacti, very dry looking, with the occasional flowering shrub, which I think is very aesthetically pleasing. Here is our target for this particular area. So in the little cave area, you can barely make out this, the woman in the, let's call them yoga pants. She was monitoring this area for the population of Zapata sparrows. On the right, you can see a Zapata sparrow. We saw, I would say, 3 or 4 of them. Not quite as well as this, but we had very, very satisfying looks at this very, very handsome sparrow. You can see the hint of very subtle shades of yellow on its belly. It's just a very good looking sparrow to me. Interestingly, there's 3 populations of Zapata sparrows on Cuba, each different subspecies. One occurs in the Zapata swamp on the, let's call, southeast coast of the island. Then there's a population in the Keys on the north side of the island, and then there's this population on the southeast corner of the island. They're completely separated from each other. There seem to be very subtle differences in behavior, in song, in habitat requirements. So these may in fact turn out to be 3 different species, which I think would be good, because then people that want to see all the species of Cuba will be more tempted to come to eastern Cuba, which hopefully will help people there with ecotourism opportunities, bringing some much-needed income for the local population. Handsome as this bird may be, this was the second endemic I was hoping to catch up with. We saved the best for last, being the Cuban grasskeet. These were hanging out with a large flock of yellow-faced grasskeets, which are much more common, pretty in their own right, but nothing like this fella. We saw 2 males, 3 females in the group of yellow-faced grasskeets, and there was lots of ooh and eyeing, as you can imagine, because that's just something to come across. So it's been a long day, as you can see. Here we are, piled into our Toyota Land Cruiser. I'm apologizing to the lady on the front seat with me because she fell asleep. But you can see people are actually smiling now. And that, to me, just epitomized the difference between the guided trip and this particular trip, in the sense that Indio was working the first time around. This time around, you can see him here on the right. He is just having a blast. He is having a great time hanging out with friends, birding with people he likes and loves, and he is just so much more relaxed. It was actually night and day, the contrast between how he was on the 2 trips, which is absolutely fantastic to see, in my humble opinion. I got to sit in front because my legs were the longest, by the way. So on the way back to Baracoa, we drove back toward La Farola. We had one last stop. There was a wetland on the way, and we saw some expected birds like least grebes, hanging out with some pied-billed grebes. We had a flyby white-collared swift, which is great, and then things got exciting. So right after the swift flew by, a merlin flew by, which is a cool bird. Here in Cuba is a really cool bird. So the group was bouncing up and down like, holy merlin, wah! And then somebody picked out something even more special from that came back. It had been hiding behind some reeds or whatever it was doing, but this bird showed up. Now, to us, this is ho-hum. It's a lesser scaup. Come on. How exciting is that? Well, the locals, the Cubans went crazy. Any scaup to them would have been unheard of. So there was much debate. Is this a greater? Is this a lesser? And so I was able to help out. This is, in fact, a lesser scaup, guys. And it turned out that for every member of our birding group, that was a lifer. And just watching 7, 8 Cuban birders bouncing up and down, that, oh my God, my lifer lesser scaup, it was very, very neat. Very neat to be there and to be able to help them identify this bird exactly to what it was. So with that, I looked up the statistics for eBirds in Guantanamo. Now, as you can see, all the people marked with X were in our birding group. Interestingly, I'm the top 12, the number 12 eBirder in Guantanamo province, which is bizarre because I've spent a week, maybe a little more than a week, in Guantanamo birding. So that gives you an idea of where things stand. Some of the other people on that list, so particularly Wayne and Tiffany Fiddler, reside on the U.S. base. So they can't leave that, so that limits them to whatever shows up on the base property. It also shows that lesser scaup is still, Roberto's the top eBirder in Guantanamo, his most recent life bird in Guantanamo. So that just kind of goes to show you how rare that bird was. And the reason why I'm bringing up this slide and saying why Guantanamo is underbirded is that it goes to show you how limited the resources are for birders there. None of the members in our group had a car of their own. And even if they did, odds are they wouldn't have the gas in the car to drive them around. Like, we just think nothing of piling in a car, driving to some place and go see birds there, even if it's just a rarity that shows up. Well, that's not going to happen in Guantanamo, or in Cuba at large, really. And that just goes to show that, to me, even with the limited resources, just going on this group birding trip, you know, Len Sanders last month mentioned that Costa Rica has pura vida. I would say that Cuba has dura vida, or a hard life. And for people to be able to go out birding. So by us donating binoculars or by me pitching in to pay for a car rental, to give them that joy, to give them the distraction from their daily trials and tribulations is I think, a very powerful gesture, a very worthwhile thing to do. So should you ever find yourself in Cuba, do something like that. Finally, and I mentioned the donation of the binoculars. This was kind of surreal. After my day of birding, we were sitting in the local restaurant and we were talking, and as it turned out, Joni Ellis, the lady that runs optics for the tropics, happened to be in the next table over. So she was there to set up a biodiversity conference that she is hoping to host there in November, and was just getting guided around to kind of get an idea of what the places were that she should take that group to. And so she and I got to talking, and we figured out that, hey, you're that guy that contacted me about donating binoculars and blah, blah, blah. So we had a wonderful little encounter, and it was just super bizarre to me that, you can't make that up. We're in some faraway corner of Cuba, and you run into somebody that you've had some, digital encounter with. So pretty neat. That's it for me. As you can see, we had some, my wife and I both had a painting commissioned by a local artist. His name is Roel Cabo Verde. I asked for something themed with the national park. So he painted this for me with El Yunque in the background, a toady on the guy's shoulder, some Polymita snails, Trogon and everything. Very cool. Very typical scenery, I guess. Very typical style, if you believe it or not. Just a lovely sunset over El Yunque. So, thank you.
We'll take questions. And as we wait for the live stream to catch up to where we are, it takes maybe 30 seconds. Maybe we can ask some questions here. And then folks on the live stream, if you do have a question, just put it in the chat and I will read it out here. Does anybody have any questions? As you're thinking of them, I will say that the folks on the live stream, we're seeing the slides advance. There's something going on with our screen here, getting to it. So we spoke, and they're working on it. We'll get it figured out for next time. But thanks to I did want to say that we're so happy to have this partnership with Ann Arbor District Library. I'm such a fan of this library. I moved here 5 years ago, and I've just been blown away, and I'm a super fan of these guys. And the experience working with them with this partnership of bringing our programs here has just made me fall in love with them even more. So thank you very much. And I think we have a question.
Thank you. I just wanted to hear more about the trip. What was it, a conference being planned in November? Are people able to go to that?
Yeah, so we were able to go to Cuba because my wife has close relatives living there. She has cousins living in Baracoa. So that's one of the exceptions that allows Americans to travel to Cuba. The other exception is for educational purposes. And so on the Optics for the Tropics website, which you see on the screen, there will probably soon be an announcement for this conference that Joni is planning, I think in November of this year, that is going to highlight the biodiversity of the area around Baracoa, and we'll have field trips into the Humboldt National Park, probably to the Baitiquiri area. There's a couple of other really cool preserves nearby that no doubt the tour will go to. So if you're interested in that, check it out. Shoot Joni an email. She's very responsive. So, and if you want more information, you can shoot me an email on the Washtenaw Bird and Nature Alliance website. You can just look up the newsletter editor. That's me. So shoot me an email, and I'll be more than happy to either connect you with Joni or to give you some more information on that opportunity.
So for those on the live stream wondering who this disembodied voice is, this is Matt Spohr. He probably can't see me, but I want to just take a moment before we have the next question and thank Jacco for bringing this idea of donating these binoculars to this group. Seeing that picture really drove it home for me, and I just think that's wonderful that you brought that to us, and we're a champion of that, and it's really a good feeling. So thanks, Jacco.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, more than happy.
Terrific presentation, Jacco.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really good.
Thank you.
In 2006, I went to Cuba, but I didn't go to Guantanamo, so this was really terrific. So as you were presenting about the group that goes out, and you had to, get the car and all of that, and you
Right.
guys all went out together, and how much you enjoyed that. I had this question evolving, and it kept changing.
Okay.
First of all, did the birders have binoculars?
Yes.
Second, then, you said we donated 3 pair.
Yes.
Did they all have binoculars, or did they share those binoculars?
No, like I said, at least 2 of the people in the group used binoculars that we donated. The other people had either their own binoculars, but the lady, for example, at the Zapata Sparrow Preserve, did not have binoculars. So she was surveying that property without
Right.
any binoculars or camera or anything. But she was very good. She knew calls, songs, you name it. So clearly, somebody like that would clearly benefit from a pair of binoculars.
Oh, definitely. I will definitely check out that site and
Yeah.
check out our site for when the next donation comes up as well. Super important.
I'm really jealous. This is Matt again. I'm really jealous that you got to go birding with a local group. I think that's wonderful.
Oh, no, I got invited to go on that, and
Yeah.
I was, hell yeah.
Could you?
Yeah, and it helped that I spoke some Spanish, because, I think Roberto speaks English, and that's about it. So speaking some Spanish is helpful. It turned out that the lady that you could see sleeping in the front seat was German, so I spoke German with her. But no, she spoke Spanish too, so when the group was talking among ourselves, it was all in Spanish, and it was really worthwhile. And to my point, that it was very much a group. Everybody brought out stuff to share. So one person had little sandwiches, and each of us got a sandwich. Somebody else had some Kool-Aid, and we all got a little cup of Kool-Aid. And it was just very genuine, very organic. It's like I was just somebody in the group, which was insanely rewarding.
That's the question I had. I wanted you to talk a little bit, if there's more you have to say about just the culture of that group, what it was like birding with them, maybe some differences that you've noticed, or,
So especially around the salt pans, everybody just kind of wandered off to the extent that you could, because we had to stay on these little rice paddy trails. But so some people wandered off trail to the left. We walked trail in the middle. Some went into trail on the right, and eventually we all kind of coalesced. And then somebody was like, "Well, I saw a yellow-crowned night heron over there," and then, "Oh, we saw some whimbrel over there," and we were like, "Well, we just saw some semi-palmated sandpipers." So it was kind of like a tit for tat, like teasing almost, like where, "Oh, you should have come this way. I told you to come this way." That kind of interaction. So it was this was a group of friends that just had a very common interest that they enjoyed, and just messed with each other, if you will. And it was just very cool to see.
That's fun. Juliet, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious about, some other people in our group have been to Cuba, and how were they able to do that? The only way you can get there is because Steph's family is there, or if you go to an educational conference of some sort?
Yes, you can go on organized tours. Like Kathy mentioned, she'd been on a birding trip in 2006, and those are allowed under one of the exceptions that the U.S. government allows.
So Wings or one of those types of groups will take us to Cuba?
You could, yes.
You could possibly.
Yes, the Cuban government does not care. It's the American government that's the problem, or the problem.
Two questions. One was, when you paid for the car, did you pay with dollars?
So we arranged for the car through a Canadian middleman.
Ah, okay.
So we,
Okay.
yeah, no, it sounds super sketchy, but that's the only way you can rent a car in Cuba.
No, it's Canadian. No, it doesn't sound sketchy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they like Cuba, if they don't go to Florida, a lot of times they like
Oh, no,
Cuba,
no,
because
and-
there's islands off Cuba.
Given a
that they-
chance, I would
yeah.
go to Cuba in a heartbeat.
Yeah, yeah.
The hell of Florida.
How did you get there? How did you fly there?
So we flew on the way, the first trip we flew Detroit, Miami, Havana. The second time we flew Detroit, Miami, Santiago de Cuba.
You were asking about how you could get there. I was on a Rhodes Scholar trip, the company Rhodes Scholars that does all these trips, and they were running, this is pre-COVID, they were running trips to Cuba under the U.S. government's people-to-people arrangement. So it was not a birding trip. But we started in the eastern end and worked our way up to Havana. And the deal was you had to, at least once every day, have an interaction with a Cuban. And it was all worked out really nicely. And I don't know if they still do those trips, but I wasn't into birding then, so I didn't look then to see what you could do with birding.
Let me check and see if anybody on the live stream has questions yet.
Yeah, but I think he can go on a guided tour. I'm not sure what the restrictions are. I know that Joni, for the conference that she's setting up, is arranging stays at bed and breakfast in Baracoa. We, like, as Americans, we cannot stay in a government-owned hotel. Even though the Cubans will say that it's fine, and that you can use your U.S. credit cards, no trouble at all. May very well be true, but you might get in trouble with the government once you get back and they figure out that you've been naughty, if you will. So we stayed in the bed and breakfast, like Villa Paradiso. Best place to stay if you ask me, and my wife will probably back me up on that. It's an absolutely fantastic place.
So the question was, how was the food?
So on our way, so this kind of goes to my point that the trip in June of 22 was crazy. We were on the road for 2 days and we basically ate Cliff Bars. We had brought a bunch of Cliff Bars and food was very tricky to track down. By the time we stopped in Ciego de Avila, everything was closed, so there was no food. And we ate at restaurants a few times. Food is actually quite scarce. There's like shortages for food. And so on the first trip we visited a few restaurants on the seaside and it's seafood. So you can, and they give you the options. We have, let's say, snapper, we have shrimp, and we have crabs. So you can pick one of the three. Basically, they live off of what is in season at the time. So in June, it was mangoes. Tons of mangoes. Delicious mangoes, but Roberto at some point mentioned that he was sick of mangoes because everything was mangoes. In January or in February, there was different fruits in season, but food shortages have gotten worse. So one of our friends there went to the store to buy chicken for his wife's birthday. He stood in line for an hour and a half, I think, and for 10 pounds of chicken, he ended up paying 3,500 pesos, which translates to, let's say, $12. Now, that doesn't sound like much to us, but the man makes 5,000 pesos a month. So there's 70% of his income to pay for 10 pounds of chicken. So obviously, it may be available, but it's unaffordable. As an American, it's easy. We went to a 3-4-star restaurant, and the four of us could eat, have a cocktail, and tip the waitress for $50, $60, which is nuts. It's fantastic for us, but the locals could never begin to dream to eat there. And there are shortages in everything. Gasoline is hard to get. Food is insecure, shall we say. Daily power outages. In June of 22, we had twice a day 4-hour outages. Sometimes longer, sometimes not, sometimes just only one, but that lasted 11 hours or something like that. Wasn't as bad in February, but it's kicked up again to where it's 6, 7, 8 hours per day. There's just no power. And if there's no power, for example, a restaurant, how do you run a business with that? You can't rely on the electronic equipment to function, so, you want to make a cocktail for your guests. Well, guess what? Your blender's not going to work if there's no power. And the gasoline that you might use to run a generator, well, that's intermittent. And if there's no power, there's no pumping the gas, so you may have some gas, but you can't pump it. So it's a very, very difficult situation on the island, and we have noticed that people are just basically voting with their feet. They're leaving. We know several people that have left between our first visit and our second. We know that the people that we interacted with had family members that had left, so they fly to Nicaragua, make the hike through Central America, and try to cross into the U.S. and Texas. Others fly to or travel to Peru or Colombia or wherever, anywhere but Cuba at this point, unfortunately. And it's causing any number of problems because it's the higher educated people that are leaving. It's draining financial resources because we can go there, bring in dollars and euros, but those dollars and euros go to pay for the plane tickets to Nicaragua, and they go to pay for the smugglers' fees. And so inflation is a big problem too. We got there in 22, it was 100 pesos to the dollar. We left in 24 and it was almost 300 pesos to the dollar. So it's rough.
On that note, what would be, this two-pronged question, what would be your recommendations for tipping? And also, would you recommend bringing things with you? And if you did bring things with you, what would you bring? What would be something that you would bring?
Medications like Tylenol, Motrin, aspirin, really over-the-counter stuff here is just unavailable there. And we brought clothes, we brought some stuff that her family could use, but we basically brought an entire suitcase of stuff that we just gave to people. As far as tipping is concerned, we just kind of went by the same rules that are here. And we basically went to the same place every night, and the waitress got to know us. So that was just, your typical, whatever, 15, 20% tip or something like that.
So we don't have questions on the live stream, but we do have a comment from Bro Ray 65, who I think is Ray Stocking. He says, no question, just a comment that the audio and video for this stream are outstanding. So again, kudos to the library for their efforts here. Thank you. Are there any other questions for Jacco? How big is this big hummingbird, Sherry wants to know?
If you've ever been to southern Texas and you've seen a buff-bellied hummingbird, it's roughly that size. So it's significantly bigger than a ruby throat. And it looks bigger because it's all dark. So it just looks imposing. And they would chase off orioles. So yeah, if the orioles got too close to their flowering shrub or tree, then they would definitely chase them off. So